They said she was just sketching, just doodling shapes no one cared about on the margins of a worn notebook. That's what the lieutenant muttered with a smirk as he tossed her report into the pile without reading it, the edges of her pencil sketches curling under the weight of indifference. Rune Vega didn't argue, didn't protest, didn't even look up from the page. She just kept tracing the outline of ridges, valleys, and shadowed trails no one else bothered to see. And when she finally closed that notebook, when she sealed it shut with the elastic strap and walked out of the briefing room, she did so quietly, calmly, as though she knew something no one else did. Hours later, when the alarms blared and the battalion realized the enemy hadn't vanished into the desert mist, but was waiting exactly where she had drawn them, the room went still. They remembered the girl with the sketches. They remembered her silence. They remembered her name, Rune Vega. And that was the night command sent a single urgent message. Rune Vega, brief the battalion. Before we dive into how a single sketch saved more lives than a dozen satellites, let me ask you, if you agree that sometimes the quietest voices carry the greatest weight, make sure to like and subscribe, because stories like Rune's deserve to be remembered, not buried in the back pages of forgotten reports. Rune Vega wasn't the kind of veteran people expected. She wasn't grizzled with gray hair or bent by decades of service. She was in her late 20s, sharp-eyed but understated, with a presence that slipped easily through the noise of barracks life. On base, she wasn't captain or sergeant, not even Lieutenant Vega. She was just Rune, the one with the battered notebook always tucked under her arm, the one who sat alone during chow, pencil moving as fast as her thoughts. Some called her strange. Others dismissed her entirely. To most of the young officers, Rune was background noise, civilian analyst, side contract hire, left over from a past deployment nobody wanted to talk about. They had technology now, after all, drones overhead, satellites in orbit, predictive software crunching data by the second. Who needed sketches when you had screens? But what they didn't know, what Rune never told them, was that the sketches weren't art. They were patterns. They were warnings. They were the difference between a battalion marching into an ambush and a battalion coming home alive. On mornings when the sun bled pale gold across the desert, Rune could be found on the edge of the perimeter fence, knees tucked, notebook balanced, her pencil moving in quiet, deliberate strokes. She wasn't sketching what she saw directly. Not exactly. She was charting sounds she heard at night when others slept. The distant hum of engines buried beneath wind, the crunch of boots on gravel where no patrols should have been, the faint metallic clank of weapons shifted against bone. She translated those sounds into marks, marks into shapes, shapes into maps. Alone, she stitched together a picture of enemy movements that no automated system could catch, because she wasn't just recording data. She was listening, feeling, connecting dots the machines missed. Still, to the others she was the girl with crayons. Rune didn't mind the jokes. She didn't mind the dismissals, either. What stung wasn't the mockery, it was the silence that followed when she tried to share. She would slide her notebook across a table in the briefing tent, its pages smudged with graphite and grit, only to have them ignored in favor of neat, sterile PowerPoint slides. "We'll stick with the drones," one officer said. "Appreciate the effort, though." The words carried the same sting as the laughter, only quieter, more casual, as though her work was a hobby, not a warning. Rune would nod, retrieve her notebook, and return to her corner seat. She had learned not to push. She had learned patience the hard way. In a world full of loud voices, silence was her weapon. But the truth was, Rune Vega hadn't always been silent. Years earlier, in a place no one on this base knew she'd ever been, Rune had earned her voice. She'd walked into firefights with nothing but a radio and a map board, guiding squads out of kill zones they couldn't see. She'd drawn quick lines on the back of ration boxes, sketched escape routes in the dust with her boot, bought precious seconds with nothing more than her ability to see what others missed. She had medals, too, in fact, folded into a box beneath her bunk. She never displayed them, never spoke of them, because they weren't for her. They were for the names etched into her memory, soldiers who hadn't come back. She carried that weight with her into every sketch, every map, every quiet note in the margins. On this particular morning, Rune sat alone at the edge of the chow hall courtyard, sunlight burning white on the pages of her notebook. The ridges she drew weren't abstract. They were the southern approaches to the base, The same approaches drones reported clear. Only Rune's ears told her otherwise. 3 nights running, she'd heard the same sequence. Distant footsteps, whispered commands in a tongue most on base couldn't parse, the clatter of something metallic against stone. It wasn't random noise. It was staging. Rune sketched it out. Circles for positions, arrows for movement, hash marks for timing. When she closed the notebook, the picture was unmistakable. An attack was coming, and no one else knew. She stood, dusted off her fatigues, and carried the notebook under her arm. At the briefing tent, young officers scrolled lazily through drone footage, their voices confident, dismissive. Clear night. Nothing on thermal. We're good. Rune stepped forward, set her notebook down. You're not good, she said softly. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. One lieutenant smirked. And how would you know that? Rune opened the book, slid it across. Silence followed. Not because they believed, but because they didn't know how to laugh outright in that moment. Hand-drawn sketches? One scoffed. Come on. We've got satellites, Vega. We don't need crayons. Laughter rolled again, low and cutting. Rune said nothing. She closed the book, tucked it back under her arm, and walked out. To them, it was nothing. To her, it was everything. Because Rune Vega knew what they didn't. Silence is a kind of preparation, and patience is a weapon. They could laugh. They could dismiss. But when the moment came, when the alarms wailed and chaos broke through the night, they wouldn't be looking at screens. They'd be looking for someone who had already drawn the path out. And Rune Vega would be waiting. That night, the desert didn't sleep, though the barracks tried to. Rune Vega sat cross-legged on her cot, the dim light of a desk lamp falling across her notebook, each page layered with pencil lines that had grown darker, sharper, more insistent. She wasn't drawing landscapes for beauty. She was sketching a warning she couldn't shake, the angles of movement too deliberate, the spacing of figures too consistent to be coincidence. Outside, the night hummed with generator noise and the faint laughter of soldiers convinced another uneventful shift was behind them. But Rune's ears tuned to something else. Silence between the sounds, breaks in the rhythm, the kind of quiet that wasn't peace but preparation. Her pencil moved faster, circling a ridge line she knew by memory, then connecting it to a shadowed culvert she'd walked past weeks before. To her, the pattern was as obvious as firelight. To everyone else, it was nothing but paranoia. She exhaled slowly, tapping the pencil against the page, the same way she used to tap the barrel of her rifle when she was on watch years ago. Nothing had changed, except this time, she wasn't in uniform and no one was listening. She closed the book with a snap, slid it under her pillow, and laid back with her boots still on. Rune Vega never slept deeply anymore. She listened, always. By 0200, the first tremor hit the perimeter, too faint to trigger alarms, too soft for cameras to register. A guard on the south tower thought he saw movement in the distance, but dismissed it as heat mirage. Rune's eyes snapped open in the dark. She sat up, slid the notebook out, and opened it flat. The line she had drawn 3 nights before matched perfectly with the gut feeling rising in her chest. She stood, grabbed her jacket, and slipped out into the night air, cool and heavy. Her boots made no sound as she crossed the compound. From the tower, the guard yawned. From the barracks, muffled snores carried. But Rune Vega walked straight toward the perimeter, scanning the tree line the way most people scan faces. And that's when she saw it. Not a figure, not a weapon, but the faintest shimmer of light catching on glass. A scope. Someone was watching them. She ducked low, heart steady but quick, and jotted a mark in the margin of her notebook. Confirmed presence. Southeast quadrant. Her pencil broke under the pressure. She didn't curse, didn't flinch, just pulled another from her jacket pocket. Rune always carried 3. You never knew when silence would demand more tools than words. At 0237, the first alarm finally triggered. Late, far too late. A breach sensor on the east fence blinked red, sending the ops tent into confusion. Radios crackled, boots scrambled, voices shouted orders no one could hear over the static. Malfunction, one officer barked. Probably a coyote, another muttered. Rune pushed through the flap of the tent, notebook in hand. Not a malfunction, she said firmly. Not an animal. They're probing, marking blind spots. They've done it 3 times already. Her voice was calm, steady, but it cut through the room like glass breaking. The officers turned, some startled, some annoyed. The lieutenant who had mocked her earlier folded his arms. "And you know this how, Vega? Your sketches told you." A few nervous chuckles followed, but Rune didn't rise to the bait. She flipped open her notebook, spread the pages across the table, and jabbed her pencil at the arcs of movement she had mapped. "They've been staging. You've missed it. Tonight they'll try again. If you don't adjust, you'll be blind in less than 30 minutes." The room went quiet for a fraction of a second, long enough for doubt to flicker, before the lieutenant slammed a palm down. "We don't have time for fairy tales. Everyone back to stations." Rune closed the book, slid it under her arm, and walked out without another word. She didn't need their permission. She needed to be ready. By 03:10, chaos was no longer theory, it was reality. The southern camera feeds went black, the grid flickered, and then, for 13 long minutes, the entire compound drowned in blackout. No lights, no comms, no thermal. Soldiers stumbled out of bunks, shouting, colliding. The lieutenant screamed orders that dissolved into the night air. Somewhere in the dark, Rune stood at the perimeter with only a flashlight and her notebook, tracing her own steps against the outline she had drawn. She moved slowly, deliberately, her breath visible in the cold. And when she found the footprints, 3 pairs, fresh, civilian boots cutting into mud at the culvert, her stomach hardened. This wasn't a drill. This was happening. She turned, sprinted toward the ops tent, her notebook clutched like a lifeline. When she burst in, the generator had just sputtered back to life, flooding the room with weak light. Officers were shouting over one another, slamming keyboards, radios buzzing uselessly. Rune didn't hesitate. She slammed her notebook open on the table, pencil stabbing at the lines. "Right here," she barked, her voice sharp now, undeniable. "They've breached twice. They'll come through again at dawn. If you don't reposition, you'll lose the southern approach." The room froze. For the first time, no one laughed. The general himself leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the precision of the marks. And then his voice, flat but direct, cut the air. "Rune Vega. Brief the battalion." In that moment, everything shifted. The lieutenant's smirk faltered, his bravado draining from his face as silence swallowed the tent. Rune's hands didn't tremble as she turned the pages, each sketch sharper, darker, more exact than the last. She outlined their movements, their intervals, the blind spots the tech had failed to catch. She spoke low, measured, like someone who had done this 1,000 times before, because she had. Her voice carried not the desperation of being believed, but the certainty of being right. Around her, soldiers who had barely acknowledged her presence now leaned in, eyes locked. Every doubt, every laugh, every dismissal collapsed under the weight of her evidence. When she finished, the general closed the notebook gently, almost reverently, and handed it back. "Get ready," he said simply. Rune Vega didn't nod. She didn't smile. She just closed the book, tucked it under her arm, and walked out into the cold desert air. Behind her, the battalion began to move, not by satellite, not by drone, but by the hand-drawn lines of a woman they had finally stopped underestimating. Dawn came not with silence, but with tension, the kind that clung to every breath, every step, every flicker of shadow across the sand. Rune Vega stood at the edge of the operations tent, her notebook under one arm, her other hand steadying a pencil like it was a weapon, because to her, it always had been. The battalion formed in a semicircle before the general, their faces half hidden by helmets and fatigue, but their eyes no longer held dismissal when they glanced at Rune. They held expectation. Hours before, she had been the quiet girl scribbling in the corner, ignored and mocked. Now, she was the one voice they needed to hear. "Rune Vega," the general said again, his tone stripped of doubt. "Brief the battalion." Rune didn't flinch. She stepped forward, laid her notebook flat on the steel table, and began. Her voice was low, calm, the cadence of someone who knew panic was poison and silence was strength. She pointed to the arcs she had drawn, showing how the enemy rotated positions every 45 minutes, how the same culvert had been used 3 nights in a row, how footprints layered on footprints created a map as clear as any satellite feed. She circled weak points, outlined ambush chokeholds, traced safe corridors they could exploit. The soldiers leaned closer, the general's jaw tightened, and even the lieutenant who had mocked her the loudest didn't dare move. When she finished, there was no applause, no chatter, Just the stillness of men and women realizing that their lives now hinged on the lines of graphite on a page. The general broke the silence with 4 words. "We move as she says." And just like that, Rune Vega's sketches became doctrine. By 0600, the battalion was in position, spread thin but precise across the ridges Rune had drawn. The desert stretched wide and deceptively calm, the kind of calm that tricks the untrained eye into thinking nothing stirs. Rune crouched near the command jeep, binoculars pressed to her eyes, notebook balanced on her knee, pencil hovering over paper even now, ready to adjust in real time. She wasn't supposed to be there. Analysts stayed intense, not on ridgelines, but the general hadn't argued when she followed. He knew better than to sideline the only one who had seen what was coming. At 0612, the first movement appeared. Faint silhouettes cresting the far ridge exactly where Rune's hand had predicted. She scribbled fast, adjusting angles, circling points of cover. "Sector 3, she said into the comm, her voice steady. 2 squads, moving slow, using the rocks for cover. They'll split here." And they did. The battalion shifted like water, flowing around the ambush before it could even form. Shots cracked in the distance, short and sharp, but they weren't panicked. They were calculated. Soldiers moved not by instinct, but by Rune's lines, her sketches guiding them through the chaos. The lieutenant, once so loud, now stood silent beside her, headset on, his eyes fixed on her notebook as if it were scripture. He didn't laugh. He didn't scoff. He waited for her pencil to move, then relayed orders without question. For the first time, Rune didn't feel invisible. She felt necessary. At 0630, the enemy realized their ambush had been read before it began. Confusion rippled through their ranks. Formations collapsed. Retreat signals flashed. Rune tracked it all, her pencil marking each shift. "They'll try the west draw," she said softly, circling a jagged line on her map. The general looked at her, then gave a sharp nod. Moments later, the battalion intercepted, cutting off the retreat, forcing a surrender that ended the engagement before it spiraled. Not one of their soldiers was lost. Not one patrol was swallowed by the desert. And when the last radio crackled with confirmation, all clear, the camp exhaled for the first time in days. Back at the compound, the battalion gathered in silence. Soldiers filed past Rune, some with nods, some with quiet salutes, none with laughter. They didn't need to speak. Their eyes carried the weight of recognition. The lieutenant approached last, his posture stiff, his mouth searching for words that wouldn't come. Rune spared him the effort. "It's not about respect," she said evenly, tucking her notebook closed. "It's about seeing what's in front of you." He nodded once, shame carving lines across his face, and stepped back. The general, however, didn't let her leave quietly. He stepped forward, lifted a hand, and called out so the entire battalion could hear. "Rune Vega." Every head turned, every boot shifted to attention. The general's voice carried. "You saved this unit. Your watch, your eyes, your silence. From this day forward, the Southern Post is named Vega's Watch." Rune's breath caught, not from pride, not from surprise, but from the quiet weight of knowing she had left something behind that mattered. She didn't smile, didn't bow. She only nodded once, tucked the notebook under her arm, and walked back toward the ridgeline where she had always belonged. Weeks later, the sign was mounted, Vega's Watch, in honor of steadfast eyes. Rune didn't attend the small gathering. She didn't like ceremonies. Instead, she sat at her usual spot near the fence, sketching the horizon as the sun dipped low. Cadets and officers passed, some offering salutes first now, some pausing to ask quiet questions about terrain, about shadows, about silence. Rune answered only what mattered, never more. She knew legacies weren't written in speeches. They were written in the choices no one else saw. When a young private asked why she kept drawing even after the ambush had been stopped, Rune looked up from her page and said simply, "Because the enemy doesn't stop moving, and neither should we." The private nodded, wrote it down, and walked away. Rune closed her notebook and stared at the horizon, the desert wide and unbroken, the silence deeper than any words. Months passed. New recruits came. Old officers rotated out. But the story of Rune Vega lingered. In training sessions, they whispered about the analyst who drew maps by hand, who outsmarted an entire ambush with a pencil and a notebook. Some said it was legend, too neat to be real. Others pointed to the plaque at Vega's watch and the soldiers still alive because of her sketches. Rune herself never confirmed, never denied. She just kept drawing, page after page, line after line, leaving behind a record not of her glory but of her watch. And when her contract ended, she didn't announce her departure. She left a single page pinned to the post. 6 words, written in graphite that smudged under the touch, but would never fade from memory. Respect is drawn, not demanded, daily. And with that, she was gone. But on quiet mornings, when soldiers walked the perimeter at dawn, they swore they could feel it still. The steady eyes of Rune Vega, sketching the horizon in silence, seeing what no one else could see, guarding them still, long after the last page was turned.